So welcome to our final closing plenary. And I want to share the words of Mayor Victoria Woodwards from Tacoma, Washington, who could not be here because she's up on the Hill lobbying, like you know we all should be doing, and you all did yesterday. And she said to me earlier today, you know, Andrea, I've been to a lot of conferences, but this one has been the most fun. So I want to thank all of you for your role in making this conference so extraordinary. And it made me realize that our typical way of evaluating conferences, where you evaluate us in your evaluations, should be flipped. And we at Prosperity Now should evaluate all of you for being the greatest participants ever. So I'm giving you 5 stars, and please clap for yourselves. But we still have work to do. You didn't think I was going to let you off that easy, right? We started on Wednesday with Songrise singing to us. What did they sing to us? Change is going to come, right? And we are ending this conference making the case for hope. And I know the external events that have happened in the last 3 days might be a little demoralizing when it comes to the hope category, but I am absolutely confident that we will be able to do that together. We are going to do that in 2 parts. We are going to begin with a group of extraordinary thought leaders and doers in our field who are going to be sharing their vision and their practical steps for how we move forward in this area. And I want to quote Mayor Michael Tubbs from the amazing panel yesterday, who said, "We have not nearly been ambitious enough in what we are doing." And that is how we need to be thinking, and that incredible panel is going to be thinking bold with all of us. Second, we are going to think about what we need to do as a movement. And as you know, we have 2 of the leading movement leaders in the nation and an extraordinary journalist to give us a sense of how we take our work to the movement level. So with that, let me ask our first panel to come up to the stage and join me. First, let me say that this plenary is sponsored by Wells Fargo, for which we are grateful. Yes? And let me bring Mike Rizer up first, who heads community relations at Wells Fargo, but has a tradition and a career that began with legal services, and he has been one of the leading voices and investors in the United States to expand the role of CDFIs in addressing poverty throughout this country. He's followed by José Quiñonez, who many of you know. He's the head of the Mission Asset Fund in San Francisco. He is our beloved MacArthur Fellow, or MacArthur Excellent Fellow. And he is at the forefront of really advancing financial inclusion and wealth building in communities of color. Then my dear friend and colleague, Ida Rademacher, who, let me say, birthday is today, all right? Who is the executive director of the Aspen Institute's Financial Security Program and has a passion for deeply shared prosperity and a background in consumer insights and policy research. And this panel is being led by Elsie Meeks. Elsie has been the founder of some of the most important financial institutions in the Native American community, and recently became the head of what is now the largest Native American philanthropy in America, the Keep Siegel Trust. And she's going to take us forward.
Thank you, Andrea. And I just want to clarify, I'm not heading it, I'm chairing the Board of Trustees. So I don't want that much work at this time in my life. So this is just such a great panel and such an opportunity to talk with people that have done some really good stuff, still in the field. I feel like all of us are gladiators, that we've been out to war and we come back in and we regroup at a session like this, and then we go back out and we try to fight that war over and over again. So thank you for all that you do, but thank you for the panelists. You know, I was thinking back, so my career sort of started with Lakota Funds in 1986, trying to start a CDFI, a business CDFI on the Pine Ridge Reservation, my home reservation. And, you know, how little we knew. I mean, we really did not. We thought we knew what the problem was. We didn't even know that. And then I think about today, and thanks to CFED, Prosperity Now, and many other great institutions, I mean, we've learned a lot. We've learned a lot of good strategies. We've learned about how poor people need to build assets, that we need to start there, and we need to think about how we build prosperity. I mean, that, coming from a reservation, was really kind of an enlightening thing for us to think about. It's like, we think about poverty a lot, but how do we think about building prosperity? And so, you know, we've learned all that, but now, I mean, we know this, we've developed good strategies, but where do we go from here? And so I wanted to ask each one of the panelists to take some time, and we are so blessed to have you all, what you think the biggest challenge is. When you think about, you know, clearing a path to financial stability, to wealth creation, to prosperity, what do you think the biggest challenge is? And I'll just let each one ask as they go.
Yeah, so I'll jump in from a financial services point of view, and I would say I'd focus in on two things: information and access to credit. And by information, what we really focus on is sustained financial coaching, right? We know the data tells us that long-term financial coaching goes a long way in moving people out of poverty. And so we look at that in a couple of ways. One is we have a great program called Hands-On Banking, not branded Wells Fargo, available anywhere, touches hundreds of thousands of people across the globe. But we also partner with many great NGOs, because many of you have really figured out how to do this very, very well. So for example, we just quadrupled a grant to NowCab in their Family Financial Capability Program, because they'd shown such great results in weaving in asset building into some of its programs about workforce development and small business. I'm also pleased to announce today that we have funded 2 new CFE, Cities for Financial Empowerment Fellows. And so we'll have 5 more cities in the United States where we're going to have an individual who wakes up every day very focused on how we're going to move the needle around prosperity and asset building. The other way that we look at information is through a product which is not yet out, but many of you have been part of the beta testing. It's called Greenhouse. It's a very, very cool app, very intuitive, that gets to know you, and particularly it helps you manage irregular income. So it knows I get paid today, I have an electric bill on Monday, a gas bill on Thursday, how much I should put away for groceries. It has a savings, a checking component. And the more you use it, the more it gets to know you, has prompts. But what I'm most proud about that is the product is great, and we've been working on it for 3 years. But what we did, and Nisha Patel touched on this in the first panel this morning, we forced ourselves to be very community and customer-centric. We kept coming back and saying, what does the community need? What does the customer need? Rather than what is it that we're able to do? And so we did, we had them keep financial diaries. We did lots of empirical studies, but we also sat down at their kitchen tables with them and spent evenings with them and saying, what is it that you really need? How can we help? So those would be, I think, in the information bucket and things that we and others in the industry are doing. The one thing I'd mention in the credit bucket is I think access to credit still continues to be a very important thing, and there are lots of wonderful things I wish I had time to talk about, but one that I think is really a really big change I'm quite proud of is a grant that we made to Grameen last year. And of course, everybody in this room knows the wonderful work that Grameen does. But we gave them a grant to start to report the credit of 58,000 of its clients. And so over the long term, they will create, right, a credit file, which will not just serve them today, but long into the future to move into the mainstream. So those would be a couple of things I'd touch on in terms of barriers and how I think the financial services industry is able to attack some of those.
Well, thanks, Joe.
Well, thank you for that. You know, at the Mission Asset Fund, we started a program called Lending Circles, and we've been doing this program for the past 10 years, and really kind of, you know, geared toward helping low-income immigrants to improve their financial security. You know, really by taking into account the practices they already do in terms of how they sort of come together to save and lend money with one another. So in the past 10 years, we've definitely have learned a lot about, you know, about themselves, about our clients, about their financial barriers. And I mean, so there's a lot of barriers. I mean, one that I would say that, you know, is very important to note is that people just are not earning enough. And there's not enough income in the household or in their jobs, so they have to couple together, you know, multiple jobs just to, like, you know, make ends meet. A lot of them, you know, don't have access to credit, to the credit system, so they really are relegated to, you know, being in the, you know, in the shadows of our financial system. And then when they're there, they're easy prey. They usually prey for, you know, predatory products and services, or they have to sort of make do with, you know, what I call like second-class citizen products, so like payday loans or just outrageous, you know, cost-prohibitive, you know, products. So people, you know, are managing, trying to make do with very little, you know, and really kind of using products that are really not designed, you know, for their success, you know, in mind. But the one barrier that I think is really important to note is that, you know, when people don't have, you know, legal status, you know, that actually is a prohibitive barrier. Because everything just gets more complicated for them. I mean, you know, for undocumented immigrants, they can't even get, you know, health insurance. I mean, you know, in the, you know, healthcare market. I mean, you know, there's even some banks nowadays where they're actually asking for legal status or even their citizenship just to verify that they can actually get a checking account. And so those things are, you know, chipping away at their, you know, very precarious financial situation already. And so the idea of talking about, you know, the immigration is really important because for them, you know, they're not just operating in a vacuum. They're operating in the political context of today. And right now, you know, they're just easy targets politically, you know, and I think a lot of institutions are actually kind of following suit and even making it harder for them. So from our perspective, our clients, they need a lot of support, but it's not just about one product or one app or one particular service. I mean, you know, of course, Lending Circles is awesome, right? And it actually is helping people, right? Do you guys agree? Thank you. That was my one applause line. But we also are very well aware that, you know, that there's bigger forces at play in their lives that we have to be aware of and counteract. So in the past year, we actually, you know, developed a series of different new products to help people either become citizens, or apply for green cards, or even get DACA. Last year, at this day last year, we actually initiated a whole new campaign to help DACA recipients get renew their DACA status. And within a course of a month, we actually raised like $4 million, and ultimately we helped close to 9,000 DACA recipients to renew that particular application. So, thank you. Oh, second applause. So from our perspective, it's about looking, you know, at the person, you know, the totality of themselves, not just their financial, you know, self, but understanding the political context that they operate, and then for us to try to, you know, be responsive and to try to, you know, develop products that actually help their financial lives.
Thank you.
Yeah, I love starting with the biggest challenge. I think when I came over to Aspen, I wanted to talk about the most consequential financial challenges facing American households. But the first challenge I want to say about what's going on and what is in the way of prosperity, is that the Prosperity Now Summit only happens once every 2 years. I mean, that feels to me like, I don't want to give anybody a heart attack on the staff, but it's such an honor to be in a room. Lunch is great, but I feel fed in other ways by coming to this community and meeting new people every time and looking across the room and across the country at who is really not afraid to roll up their sleeves and wrestle with the complexity of the issues and the challenges. So even though we'll boil it down to a soundbite today in terms of those challenges, we know how complex the issues are that we're up against. I think the other thing I'd say going into this is that I also feel really privileged to be on stage with people who it's not always the opportunity to sit in a chair in a room where everybody else recognizes the need for having the products and services and systems work for people. And so I would say that in other rooms, I would have to say the challenge is that we actually don't know enough. We're not proximate enough to who we're actually solving problems for. But I don't have to say that part. I think what it becomes incumbent on me to say is that creating a better toolbox for individuals will not go far enough in terms of the systemic drivers of inequality in our country today. And so that part, I do think, has to be said, that there are institutional fixes that are also barriers. The way that I think that manifests right now most presciently for households is in consumer debt. So I would say the flip side of access to credit is that what we have to understand in community today is that many of the families and households that we care about are exposed to debt a long time before they ever get access to credit. The drivers of debt are growing in terms of non-loan debt. It's medical fees, it's fines and fees, it's unpaid bills. Unpaid bills is 30% in collections. That is 30% of what is in collections is unpaid bills. Medical debt, 20% of households in the US have medical debt on there. So if you're dealing even with access to credit, understanding that maybe long before you even get to actively build a credit profile, you're going farther back. So I do think that at the household level, debt becomes the way that we are manifesting in this country what's broken about labor markets and wage stagnation and income volatility, and what's broken about financial markets in terms of how we actually think about credit needing to be working in a triangle with savings and with insurance, both public insurance and a new social contract. And for me, that is where this sits.
Thank you.
Yeah,
You know, I was just thinking about in terms of, you know, I mentioned we started Lakota Funds in 1986, and that we didn't really know what the problem was. We thought we did. We thought people couldn't get loans. And what we learned many years later, I think, was that we did need to quit talking about poverty, and we started giving people the permission to talk about creating wealth. That sort of turned us on our head about how we approached our work. And, you know, this session is about hope, or this conference is about hope, and how you give people that hope. I mean, how do you turn them from, they're not making enough money to save, they're not, you know, the tools they have aren't the right ones necessarily. I mean, in the mainstream institutions, the ones they have access to, payday lending. But because there isn't that hope, that's who they turn to, because it's a very short-term fix. I just wonder if you have any quick thoughts about that.
Do you want to start there, or do you want?
Go ahead.
Me to start. So the biggest hope, is that what gives me hope, besides being in this room? Look, I think that, and somebody just said it earlier, we actually have access to the kinds of data we didn't have when this field started. We did go with the premise that assets matter in fundamentally different ways than income, and that institutions matter in determining who has access to building assets and who doesn't. We knew that before we had all the data, and every new layer of data that comes out that shows us what is going on in the household dynamics and in the macro economy shows that that is true. And similarly with the qualitative research, we know that there is not only is the driver of stress, that financial stress is always highest on the list, but it's also just the act of saving reduces that stress. The act of having that kind of the back end system of debt managed reduces stress. So I think for me, when I try to get clear about what gives me hope about the future, it is that we are using these new tools of data to understand what are the drivers and dimensions of the financial challenges we're seeing. And when it comes to wealth, I mean, I do think it's important to know that we talk about, I mean, I'm deeply, I say it, but deeply shared prosperity and a more inclusive economy are not, they're not just words. But to say what a deeply shared prosperity looks like, the best it ever looked in this country, 1980s, this is the Emmanuel Saez and Gabriel Zuckman data, the best it ever was in this country was that the bottom 90% of the population owned 35% of the wealth. That was as good as it ever was, and we know that underneath that macro level, so many of the families of color, so many women, so many people had nothing, right? That their net worth was zero. So if the best we ever had was 35%, that has gone down to less than almost 20% of the wealth. We have gone backwards to rates of wealth inequality that we've had for many years. But we know now the drivers of that. We know the upstream incentives to institutions. We know the policy levers. Books like Bob's come out, and more people read them every year. And the quickening that is happening in a room like this is indicative of what's happening around the country, and that gives me hope. I think we'll have another round of conversation on that, but my sense is we have to name it. I love the goal of naming close the racial wealth gap in a generation. I love it. I also think that we could quantify if the bottom 50% of all households had 2% of the wealth at the height of shared prosperity, and it's down to 1% now. Bob's idea of a few $1,000s comes pretty close to looking at what does it look like to at least get the bottom half of the population back to 2 or 3% of the wealth. It doesn't sound threatening to those who struggle with loss aversion, but it's incredibly empowering. That level of ownership stake in society is transformative to democracy and to the economy.
You know, what gives me hope is really working with clients themselves. I think that the problems are enormous, but in reality, poor people, not just in the United States, but all over the world, have really managed to figure out ways of going around those obstacles themselves. And there's a lot of ingenuity, a lot of know-how within their own practices. I mean, that is the basis actually of lending circles. It's not something that that we just kind of came up with it in some dark room somewhere writing this up. This is really the practice that people are already employing just to manage what life outside of the financial system. And so what it took for us to do is to basically open our eyes to recognize their ingenuity and then figure out a way to actually make everybody else as well to recognize what they were doing. So what gives me hope is not necessarily for us to go out and come up with some notions or some solutions and come down from the mountain and give them some tablets or apps, I guess, nowadays, to do that. That's not what is needed. What is needed is to actually, recognize that what is good and true in people's lives, to recognize their ingenuity, and to recognize, that even there's some of the solutions are something that we all need to replicate, which is about, building strong relationships with each other. Because that's, it might sound kind of hokey, but the idea of relying on your friends and family and having strong bonds, in that actually is a, anti-poverty measure. Imagine that, right? Instead of trying to push people as being just like total individuals, just atoms within themselves, or random individuals out in the in open sea. That's not the case. We're like people with relationships, people with with social capital that we can come to bear. And so we need to sort of recognize that and value it and uplift that. So that gives me hope. And it gives me hope because it doesn't mean that we, again, just because we don't have the solutions right now, it doesn't mean that they're not out there. And I think as a field, we need to sort of kind of go beyond just our simplistic view of the problem, and even evolve from our simplistic notions of what the solutions are, so that way we can embrace the complexity a little bit more and allow for something to develop that may or may not necessarily be how we started the conversation with.
Good. I would say there are two things. One is not only do we have much better data, but we're much better about measuring impact. And so we're able to know what is working and what's not, much better than we were even 5-10 years ago. And then secondly, building on that, and you talk about social capital, I think we are much better about communicating and reaching across sectors when we do have something that works and is replicable. And so I get encouraged about that when we see programs that work that we're able to build on and share and then take to scale.
Thank you. Thank you. That was.
Can I jump in with a,
Yeah.
would you have another question?
Well, I want to ask before we're done, what big, bold vision you have that we might be able to accomplish or at least make progress for by 2020, the next asset. But if you have something.
No, I'll go there with that.
Yeah.
That's
Okay.
great.
All right.
That's great. I wasn't sure. I think I'll switch gears a little bit with the big, bold vision because it'll key off of the social relationship piece. I think the kind of social change and economic change we need in this country is literally a brick by brick process, even as we look at the systems. It is relationships and leadership that is going to be at the core of this. And when I say leadership, I mean, let's go ahead and call out the elephants in the room. And I see a lot more leaders in the corporate sector and leaders like the ones who were on this stage yesterday morning, the mayor's panel. I mean, oh my God, right? It was amazing. I've been just rereading the tweet stream is enough to get me jazzed every morning, as I get up. There's a book that came out this week. And beginning, it's called Winners Take All. And the person who wrote it, Anand Jihadis, kind of formulated his thesis by being in some of the different kinds of leadership rooms that he calls philanthrocapitalism, kind of the people who, there's a bit of a consensus that there's so many people on the bandwagon of doing more good in the world. But there are not enough people saying we need to do less harm. And that's the whole thesis of the book is if we're really going to make change, we have to do less harm. Kate said it beautifully on the stage today. There's a way that extra seat has to come along with you. I'm going to keep my folding chair. Doing less harm looks a lot like looking around you, making sure that you're not benefiting at somebody else's expense. There is no zero-sum game here. And in fact, we are the wealthiest country in the history of civilization. And we act like we are living in scarcity, and we are not. And so my hope, my hope is that, a little bit different than Bob's, I think we can do a lot. I think we can do a lot with the redistribution. We need to look at the tax cut policy and the way that drives inequality. But I also think that the primary distribution of the economy, who gets a first cut at the pie and how much, but the pie is growing, people. We can grow it. And it grows faster when everybody already has a stake and a kitchen to cook one in and all of that. So I do think that, that for me, growing an explicit call out as a field to growing the wealth and well-being of every American household, especially households led by women and community and people of color, is the hope. And I think we can quantify it, and I think we can set benchmarks to get there, and I think that everybody has a role in that.
Yeah.
Either one of you want to follow that?
Sure. It's not easy, but what I have to say, I think, very much relates to that. I think that I'm going to speak both with my foundation and corporate hats on and say that I think, as I look out boldly and with a vision, that we have to have a fundamental shift about the way that we do philanthropy in this country. And it really is very much in line with the conversation we've been having all week around racial equity, right? And so we have to move away from equality and really look very deeply with a race and equity lens on things. And so, for example, at Wells Fargo, we are now reimagining our whole philanthropic approach. The vast majority of what we fund out of the foundation today, which this year will be over $400 million, goes to communities of color. But we really haven't gotten underneath that, right? To really look at our drivers and if we're appropriately taking account of historic racism and barriers that exist. And so we're at that work today. So what I would tell you boldly is we're looking very much at ourselves, and we know we really have to hold the mirror up and ask some tough questions. But when we come back here in 2 years, and I guess it's going to be in this beautiful place again, I will say that Wells Fargo will have spent $1 billion at that point in philanthropy, and 2 of our 3 pillars are on economic empowerment and diversity and inclusion. So this very important work lies really sweetly in there, and so we'll come back with, I think, a stronger strategy with impact and measurable results.
Thank you.
You know, I think we as a field need to embrace the reality that America is different. The world has changed. Even after the day after the current administration ceases to exist, America is going to be different. And so I think, when we come back again in 2 years, I think we need to sort of grapple with that reality and come up with new ideas, new bold solutions to the more complicated, realities of our country and the people that we serve. I think when we are locked in some state of mind of what America was 20, 30, 40, 50 years ago, and there's that simplistic notion of reality, we will always come up with very simplistic solutions to very complicated problems. And I think if we do that, we will continue to fail at our work. And I think what the bold statement would be, let's embrace that. The world's changing, and we're not in control of what is happening, or we don't know what the next tweet is going to be about, or the next anonymous op-ed is going to say. I personally, I know that I don't control that, but the thing that we do control is our ability to sort of embrace the challenge and meet complexity with complexity. And I think if we do that, then I think we can honestly come up with solutions to actually meet the real needs of our community.
Great.
Give this panel a big round. We could have used.